Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. The Dole Institute would like to hear from you about today's program. Please let us know your feedback by contacting us on social media or via email at doleinstitute@ku.edu. To view past programs, visit our online video archive at www.doleinstitute.org. A video of today's presentation will be available on our website soon. We would like to encourage each of you to consider becoming friends of the Dole Institute. Our friends help keep our programs free and open and support archive research and our student activities. Please contact us if you are interested. After the presentation, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to turn off your cell phones. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Sean Kalick.
Thank you. I don't have to give a speech today, which is fantastic. I get to introduce Dr. Valentine, which is easy. It's my pleasure to thank the Dole Institute for once again supporting the DMH, the Dole Institute series, and I want to introduce our speaker today, which is Dr. Janet Valentine. Received her PhD from the University of Alabama, worked at the Air National Guard as a historian in the Joint Staff Office, right? As a historian before coming to CGSC in 2009. She's one of our Korean War experts and also teaches courses on the Korean War and also women in military studies and women in the military. Can you hear that? Good now? Oh, too fast. It's going to be a tough crowd. Sorry, I'm setting you up. 2009, she came to DMH after an illustrious career at both the Joint Staff History Office and then Air National Guard Office. She got her PhD from the University of Alabama. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Janet Valentine. Speak slowly, not like me.
He's a tough act to follow, isn't he? Yeah. You can hear this well, right? It's no problem? Okay, great. Thank you. As you know, this series is about the curriculum that we teach at Command and General Staff College, those captains and majors that we are responsible for helping to turn into big thinkers, you know, those guys who are going to make all those decisions at the Pentagon in a few years. One of the things we talk about, a theme throughout our course, is change in the military and innovation and how that occurs. And one of those lessons is about the interwar years and the development of amphibious assault doctrine. And I'm very careful in using the word assault because it's not simply amphibious landing doctrine. There's a big difference between landing on a beach and landing on a beach when someone is shooting at you. So this is one of those lessons that I think is particularly a particularly good example of getting innovation as close to right as you can get it before you actually test it under fire. So I think this is a very nice example for our students in how to think ahead of what you have actually experienced. And I won't read the slide for you. I'm confident that everyone here can read it. But this is just to set up the idea for our students of what it is that we're looking at, is that during the interwar years, we tend to think of the big senior services, the Army and the Navy, and we sometimes forget the Army Air Corps or the Marines. And so this is to remind them that there are other organizations who are contributing to that, all of those changes that happened during the interwar period. The inspiration for amphibious assault doctrine, as many of you know, comes from the failed assault on Gallipoli during the First World War. Gallipoli is that peninsula from Turkey, and the purpose of assaulting the Gallipoli peninsula during World War I was to try to relieve some of the pressure on the Russians that the Turks were applying in the Caucasus, and to allow Russia a Mediterranean port from which they could supply their troops and move their troops in and out. And Gallipoli was a fantastic failure for just about any reason that you can think of. Primarily, it is not well thought out. It's done ad hoc. No one has really anticipated what it is they're going to encounter when they're there. They really thought that the Turks would not be able to deal with this landing and the combat power that the British would be able to contribute to divert from the Western Front to this alternate area. They hadn't reckoned with, the British had not reckoned with the fact that the Turks were being advised and had been trained for some years by the German army. And so the Turks are well prepared when the British get there. They have used barbed wire to their advantage. They have organized and trained so that they can move units from one place to the next very quickly. No one had anticipated that problem. The other issue, of course, is that there's really no coordination between the Army and the Navy at Gallipoli. No one had considered what it means to land a large number of forces on a defended beach and supply them, make sure that supplies are arriving in the order that they're needed. No one anticipated what kind of medical care would be required. What they were anticipating was simply a beach landing. And so the idea of a beach assault was really outside their frame of reference. They were accustomed to landing on a beach, forming up in lines, and charging, and that wasn't possible here. So after Gallipoli, everyone simply decided, no more. This is not anything that can be done. So this is where we encourage our students to look a little bit beyond that idea, because that's what happened in the interwar years. Gallipoli was supposed to be that example of things that cannot happen, and the Marines ultimately decided that it can be done. But they're looking at Gallipoli in a different way. They're looking at Gallipoli not so much in why we don't, and they're not asking the question, why don't we want to do this, but how can we do this in a way that no one else has anticipated. So this is just a list of those things I mentioned earlier, all of the problems that had beset the British landing at Gallipoli. Now, the Marines have a traditional mission for the United States, and in this period, they were still looked upon as those landing shore parties from the naval ships. They are going to repel attacks on those ships. Those traditional things that we always think of the Marine Corps doing. But in the interwar period, it becomes apparent that there is a movement largely for cost-cutting purposes and for, sort of jealousy purposes that you don't really need the Marine Corps. So there's a movement especially among Army supporters, that maybe it's time for the Marine Corps to go away. Why do we have to have two armies? As the development of surface craft and surface doctrine advances, do we really need these Marines for these traditional roles? And it's becoming clear that in order for the Marine Corps to survive, it's going to take a little more than great uniforms. Now, the Marines always have had a place in sort of the American mythology and the American heart. You know, they look cool, they do great things, but when it comes down to budgets and who is going to survive, they are frequently the first place people look. And in this period, the threat to them was very real. And so in terms of, sorry, that didn't go where I thought it was going to go. So the Marines have to start looking for a way to justify their continued existence. And they do that by looking at what the senior service, the Navy, is planning in case there is another war. And it's pretty obvious to everyone that there is going to be another war by the middle or to the end of the 20s. Everybody understands that there's going to be a war. In the United States, there's expectation that, in fact, when we go to war, we'll be going to war against the Japanese. We have a plan for going to war with Germany. We have a plan for going to war with just about any country on the globe. But the one that the Navy particularly focuses on is War Plan Orange, and that's the plan for war with Japan. And one of the things, or many of the things, that the Navy has to contend with is that the distance from the United States to Japan is thousands of miles. And how do you get there in this period? There's not an expectation, of course, that we'll be loading our troops onto air transport, but that we're going to have to fight this bit by bit across the Pacific, and that we're going to have to use ships to do that. The expectation, of course, is also that the Japanese will have taken possession of most of those islands in the Pacific. And taking a look at this, notice that the original War Plan Orange has the United States going in a much straighter line than we ultimately do. Okay. So like any good plan, it doesn't survive first contact, but the basic understanding of what it is that we're going to have to do when we go to Japan is in place. So recognizing that the Navy is focusing on the war with Japan, the Marine Corps then determines that if it is going to stay relevant, if it is going to stay alive, it has to find a way to be a major part of that fight against Japan. And looking at what is going to have to happen in that fight, it's clear that these islands that the Japanese are expected to take are going to have to be taken back in very bloody contests. So the Marine Corps focuses on how it can accomplish that. There are two people who are in the Marine Corps itself who are credited with having the most influence on this. One of them is Lieutenant General Jean Lejeune, who is the Commandant of the Marine Corps in the 20s and early 30s. He is, again, behind this, looking for that inspiration. What do we do? How do we get there? How do we make sure that the Marine Corps survives? And he is, in fact, truly a visionary because he's looking forward. He's not looking for what we can't do. He's saying, hey, what can we do? And we also have to think Major Pete Ellis. And he's a very dashing figure if you don't take into account that he suffers from chronic depression and chronic alcoholism. He's a very handsome fellow. He's brilliant. And we often, of course, associate diseases like alcoholism or conditions like depression with brilliance. But this is something he suffered from his whole life, and he spent a lot of his time kind of being protected by the Marine Corps. But in this period, what's most important is that Lejeune looks at him and he says, I've got a guy here who can think what we call now outside of the box. And so he sends Ellis to the Pacific to study what would be necessary in order to make not only successful landings, but where, in fact, those best landings might be, things like tides. And so he's taking detailed notes while he's in the Pacific about the various islands and their conditions. He's also jotting down ideas about how some of these things can be overcome. And part of what he does goes into the larger studies that the Marine Corps undertakes during the interwar period. Ellis ultimately dies in 1923 at a fairly young age, probably from alcohol poisoning. It might just be liver failure, but there's some speculation that he was encouraged to drink himself to death on a particular island by allies of the Japanese. We're not quite sure how that occurred. In order to create, however, the tentative landing manual, it takes more than those notes that Ellis jotted down in his time in the Pacific. You have to figure out how to get at those nuggets of overcoming all of those failures that occurred at Gallipoli. So one of the really, I think, inspired things that the Marine Corps did in order to figure this out is they go to the people who are supposed to be, their best officers, and they go to the experts in these various requirements that you're going to need, things like logistics, the infantrymen, all of those things, and ask them to study them individually. They also go to their students at their schools, because there's an assumption there too that there's a lot of what we now call critical thinking going on, and that they also have the experience and will be able to bring something to it, something to this process, this learning process, that you might not get from other people. So it's a fascinating period in Marine Corps history because of the way that the Marine Corps under Jean Lejeune sort of embraces the general think tank that the Marine Corps, that the service offers. And that is possible really largely because the service is a much smaller service. It would be something that would be much harder for the Army and the Navy to accomplish. There's a lot of grousing even now about how difficult it is, to get those senior services to change, to move along. And the thing is how do you do that if you're a much larger service than, say, something that is more contained and smaller like the Marine Corps. So the Marine Corps does have an advantage in terms of innovation and change, but that still allows us, regardless of the size of the Marine Corps, we still can use this as a good model of how innovation occurs and the kinds of questions that are useful in determining how to implement change in a military organization in particular, but actually in any organization. So the Landing Operations Manual contains 6 essential ideas for these opposed landings. The first one is that you have to take a careful look at command relationships. Who's going to be in charge of what, when they're going to be in charge of anything, and what that will be. What is the role of naval gunfire support? How do you implement it? At what point is it useful? How do you supplement naval gunfire support? Is naval gunfire support sufficient, or do you have to have something else along with it? Aerial support. There's a lot of development in aviation doctrine and in airframes during this period. So the Marine Corps is looking at a sort of multi-platform approach to these opposed landings. They're taking into consideration everything that they may have at their disposal. So again, this is a really good example of looking forward as opposed to looking at tradition or the naysayers. And again, with those command relationships, who is in control of the airspace? When does that control change from naval control to marine control? And exactly what does that aerial support look like? There are questions during this period that get asked and answered about combat air support, as we would call it now. And some of you will know that the Marine Corps keeps that organic to their own service. They decided, in part from this experience, that what we're going to do is we're going to supply our own combat air support. The ship-to-shore movement. Now, that sounds pretty simple. You put some guys in a boat, and you take them to the shore. And that's essentially what they had done in Gallipoli, and that had proved insufficient. It was also one of those things that people said, well, hey, this is why you can't do it, because you can't get them safely from ship to shore. And the Marine Corps says, well, I think we can. So we're going to see how we can improve on that. Securing the beachhead. Once you get those men landed on the beach, how do you make it safe enough? You notice I didn't say safe, but safe enough so that you can continue to land other men, continue to land supplies and equipment on the beach as needed, so that you can build up sufficiently then to actually carry the assault, to go on the offensive, and gain that island, retake that island from the enemy. Oh, I'm sorry, I punched the wrong button. There we go. And of course, logistics and communications. Logistics was one of the weakest parts of that dreadful Gallipoli experience. They were the Anzac forces, those Australian and New Zealand and ultimately regular British forces that were fighting in Gallipoli were regularly without food, without enough ammunition, without the day-to-day equipment and supplies that they needed. And that is in part because no one had thought how to do this. And there hadn't been the experience either about how one goes about it. And communications. There is no system set up on Gallipoli for communicating either ship to shore or from unit to unit, from commander to commander at Gallipoli. That's one of the biggest issues that the Gallipoli forces faced, and the Marine Corps, in part because they're the Marine Corps, recognize that you have to be able to communicate not only with other big decision makers, but that your smaller unit commanders also have to be regularly informed of what is occurring. So they paid a great deal of attention to logistics and communications. As I mentioned when I was talking about those 6 essentials, you can see some of the questions that are being asked. And so you can ask a student, what would you do if? And hopefully they are all already going to have arrived at some of these answers for themselves, and most of them do. We have very bright students. But ultimately, in the tentative landing manual, this is what they decide, that this force is going to work for the Navy commander. Now think about that for just a minute, and think about that in practicality and if you're actually undertaking a landing. The Marine Corps is going to constantly report back to the Navy commander and ask for guidance. Do you believe that? Do you think that's going to work out? Nevertheless, this is what they ultimately decide in that tentative landing manual from 1934. There will be co-equals for planning, and there are decisions made for who's going to support what and who will be supporting functions, who will provide those supporting functions. Although it's clear that you need naval gunfire support, that was true at Gallipoli as well, there lacked that coordination between the naval surface ships and the landing forces. There are also limitations to what those naval guns can do for any landing. Their trajectory is much flatter, so there are questions about just what kinds of targets they can be used for and how useful they are for once those Marine Corps forces are on the beach. What kind of ammunition should you have? Should it be high explosive, or should it be something else? And again, one of those things that had bedeviled Gallipoli, the Gallipoli campaign in extreme, was who's going to coordinate this? Who's going to be in charge of what and when? That theme runs through all of the interwar planning for these amphibious assault ideas. It's the coordination piece and the communications piece. Without those, you don't have an idea that's going to work. It doesn't matter how carefully you plan who's going to, what kind of aircraft you're going to use or what kind of ships you will use for this. If you can't figure out who's going to be in charge at any given moment and how to exchange information, then you're going to fail. So some of the most impressive pieces of this doctrine rest with that ability to ultimately determine how to function in what we would now call a joint environment. Something that, although the Marine Corps and the Navy have done for virtually their entire existence, doesn't require the same kind of command and control, same communications, same arrangements that all of this new technology and all of the changes in conditions requires. Aerial support. Now, this is pretty new to everybody. We, of course, have the Army Air Force. That's not new to us. But now we have carrier air as well. And this is still a very relatively new process. The United States had only really gotten involved or really taken to heart the idea of development of carriers and naval aircraft in the 20s, so this is still pretty new. And it's not altogether sure, even though in the Air Force they're doing a lot of fascinating things with air doctrine, they're still not sure exactly what the role of aircraft carriers will be and how we will use those carrier-based aircraft. And in fact, War Plan Orange is largely based on the idea of using battleships. So we're still trying to figure out exactly what you do in the 30s with naval aviation. So with that comes, again, these big questions, the same kinds of questions that you see being asked about naval forces and Marine forces. They're fundamentally the same questions. They involve, for the most part, different technology and manpower that have different purposes. So the same kinds of questions, again, that we asked today. These are not new questions. They're not unique to the interwar period. They're not unique to the Navy. They're not unique to the Marine Corps. What is interesting is how the Marine Corps handles these questions and the responses that they ultimately develop for them. Now, this is a very complicated mathematics problem. I know there's a formula. There's someone in the room that can give you the formula in the question and answer period if you would like to have it. I am not that person. But I brought that support just in case. But that ship-to-shore movement, how do you get to the beach? You have these great ships. You can put a lot of troops on them. In the traditional way, you had just sort of had towboats, man-powered rowboats, and a few barges. And if what you're doing is landing a 19th century army on a beach, that's okay. That works. But it's not going to work, as we have learned at Gallipoli, if you have more advanced artillery and if you have a prepared defense. So again, the idea is what they're trying to figure out is how to do an amphibious assault and how to make it as economical as possible. We don't want to lose any more blood or treasure than we absolutely have to. We're willing to do it. We understand it's going to happen. But let's make this as logical and as, again, economical as possible. So how do you get to the beach, and what kind of craft do you need to do that? What are those craft going to look like? How big do they need to be? What shape do they need to be? This is the technology, one of those technology pieces that the Marine Corps has to address. We have some good ideas about how to do this, but how are we going to make that happen with what exists? And the answer is we can't make it happen with the technology we have at our disposal. So we're going to have to create something that is more appropriate to what we need. Okay, once you get to the beach, what are you going to do with them? What does a landing party, a combat landing party, look like? What are you going to need to support them immediately? And again, we come back to those same questions that have been asked repeatedly in everything else. Who's in charge? At what point are they in charge? And then you also have, again, that mathematical piece of how to control traffic and manage the space that you are possessing. Why do I need a shore party and a beach master? This is a good example of that need for the Navy and the Marine Corps to function in, again, what we call a joint environment. The beach master coordinates all of those Navy assets that are required to get from the troop ship, the troop carriers, to the high water mark. The beach master then is part of the Marine component. And he is there to organize the beachhead. And this illustration is actually a very clean illustration. It wouldn't have been this pretty. You know, it wouldn't have been this organized. It wouldn't have gone this well. But nevertheless, this is a good illustration of what you're hoping for. Right? You always hope that everything will go exactly as planned. But what's interesting about this illustration is it does give you some idea of how you would organize it. For instance, if you look at these two vertical red stripes, that tells you what beach you're landing on. In this case, we're looking at Tarawa, and that indicates that this is Red Beach 2. Red flags, there are two of them. And anybody who's coming in can see those immediately. I know I'm on the right beach. These indicators here, these flags, are also hung horizontally, vertically. I always have a hard time with that, vertically, telling you what it is you're supposed to be delivering to that specific beach. So in this case, it's medical. For instance, medical here, this one's easy to decipher. Number 2 is ammunition. Number 3 is food. 5 is fuel. So in this case, they're supposed to be supplying Red Beach 2 at Tarawa with fuel. They also have a system that they can set out flags on the ground for help with communicating with air support. Logistics is one of those problems that is going to pose real difficulties for the Marine Corps, not just because it's a truly difficult math problem, but because they're starting kind of from the bottom of the barrel. Remember, this is the interwar years. Nobody really wants to spend that much money on any of the military services, and the Marine Corps is literally fighting for its continued existence. This is that point in the Marine Corps history where it meets probably the greatest threat to its continuation. Fortunately, the Marine Corps has friends in powerful places. It's good to make friends. President Roosevelt had served as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, so he's not only knowledgeable of naval affairs, he has a soft spot for the Navy and, more importantly, for the Marine Corps. And so he is willing and eager, in fact, in many ways, to support some of those ideas that Lejeune has promoted. And you also have Congressman Carl Vinson, and that's going to be a name that is familiar to many of you. He was a important primary promoter of naval interest throughout his career. And largely through his actions in Congress, Congress manages to approve 12 transports for the fleet during this very this period when we just don't have a lot of money. I'm sorry, sometimes I'm more articulate than other times. I mentioned Operation Galvanic, the assault on Tarawa, earlier. And why this is important is that all of those ideas that had been propagated and put forward during the interwar period is nothing more than a theory. A theory is wonderful, but how do you arrive at doctrine? You know, something that you know that is going to work. And that requires a combination of things. So you have the idea, the theory, and then you have the history or the experience. And you mix them all up in a bowl, and they talk with each other, and they exchange ideas for a while, and then you wind up with that piece that we can actually call doctrine. So you begin with this tentative landing manual, and ultimately through testing, largely during World War II, you wind up with something that is actually a well-developed amphibious assault doctrine. But you have to test it first. And the first real test for this fascinating idea of how you overcome one of the biggest problems in retaking all of those islands that the Japanese will have certainly taken, and to retake territory that the United States will need to control in order to fight Japan back toward the home islands, but you have to test it, and this is where we engage in that first test. And this is another of those instances where paintings or drawings don't really reflect the truth of what you're doing. Again, this is ideal, and that doesn't look like a very dangerous explosion, but I'm pretty sure if you're a Marine making your way to shore, this is going to look a lot scarier than that drawing suggests it might need to.
Did they have amphibious on Guadalcanal?
Yeah, yes they did, but not, they still didn't have some of those basic ideas in place. There were still questions about, no, okay.
That's an amphibious movement, there's not necessarily an assault that takes place. Because the Japanese had that defended items on the stage. It was largely amphibious movement as opposed to assault.
That's why I bring Marines with me.
I'm her husband, by the way, so there you go.
Yeah. Yeah.
Unopposed landing, the fighting takes place once the Marines get established ashore. Not so on Tulagi, an island adjacent to Guadalcanal, unopposed landing.
Okay, and you can talk to Mr. Metter, who's one of our historians, at length, I hope, afterwards if you're interested in the Tulagi landing. But what we're talking about at the minute is Tarawa. So this is D-Day at Tarawa. These blue lines indicate, and Tarawa is a group of islands. The one that we're talking about here is BTO. The blue lines indicate those areas that the Japanese are holding. They're also the best beaches for landing. So in order to take Tarawa, the Marine Corps are testing its new ideas at some of the most unadvantageous points on this island. The red indicates the beaches where the Marines are landing. Red Beach 1, 2, and 3. This is a main pier, and all of these beaches have some sort of seawall or something else in the way of the ideal landing beach. So there's nothing ideal about landing here, but this is where the government, the Marine Corps, and the United States has decided we need to do it. We need to take Tarawa at this point in the war, and so you work with what you have. This is a picture of what should be Red Beach 1, and you can see the seawall. This is an Amtrak, one of those technological developments that occurs between the First World War and World War II. Most of the landing craft that the Marine Corps develops in the interwar period, we have to thank all those swamp dwellers for. Andrew Higgins in Louisiana, Robeline in the swamps of Florida. Because they have already been working with for most of their technological lives with boats simply that are geared toward the same kinds of beaches and have the same requirements for low draft and ability to turn in small places that you need for these amphibious assaults. We take Tarawa, but it is, for us at least, considered a truly unacceptable price. From it, though, comes an improved doctrine, a doctrine that works much better after Tarawa than it does leading up to and at Tarawa. You solve some of those command and control issues. There's still, although if you recall, the tentative landing manual says that the Navy is always going to be in control, the Marine Corps determines that, yeah, we don't think that is a very good idea because you can't see what's really going on where we are. And some of those arguments between the commanders were pretty bitter, but ultimately it is decided that as long as you're on the ship and it's a Navy asset getting you there, that's a naval problem. Once you land, once you're there, then it's a Marine Corps problem. So there's actually a divided responsibility, but also what comes from that is improved coordination. Rather than trying just to say, okay, to avoid the coordination problem, everybody is going to be responsible to the Navy commander, it becomes clear that what we really need to improve not only is communications, but the coordination piece. And from that, then, we extrapolate with our students kind of what right looks like, okay? Yeah, it's not perfect, but it's come so close to being the right idea before it's actually put into practice that, yes, initially it's very costly, and it continues, in fact, to be costly because of the enemy that we're fighting, but that it is a fundamentally sound theory that when tested against history, that experience proves that with a few tweaks, after having been well considered by experts in the field and all ideas accepted as worth discussion, that you can come up with something, you can devise a theory that will stand that test and allow you to make much bigger strides more quickly. So for me, this is one of those lessons where I can say to the students, okay, we've talked an awful lot about, oh man, did they get it wrong? Here's an opportunity to talk about someone really had a good idea for how to get it as close to right as you can get it when it's only being tested in a laboratory. So I am willing to answer questions about any of this, and for those details about logistics, I refer you to Dr. John Curatola, and for those fine details about Marine Corps history, I would recommend Mr. Metter or Dr. Curatola. And there was a gentleman beforehand who had a question for my husband about a particular Army liaison officer that he could not answer, but perhaps Mr. Metter can.
Did the United States during the late 20s and into the 30s attempt to find out what Japanese amphibious tactics and were, and what we might borrow or steal from them?
I think the United States, and in this particular case, the Marine Corps in the interwar period, were very good at stealing ideas. I mean, why reinvent the wheel? Moreover, know your enemy. And that's one of the fundamentals of this theory as well, is we have to know what we're up against. Otherwise, no amount of preparation will do us any good. And moreover, we have to know, have a good idea of what it is, how many men we're going to need, how much we're going to need to land on the beach initially, and how to answer that very difficult mathematic problem of things like how to load a ship for combat. What do we need off first, and what are we going to need off last? So yes, a lot of intelligence. Pete Ellis is a good example of that, and a lot of thought into how we might counter what we already know about Japanese processes.
Yes, one thing I think your first slide there, Plan Orange, and you said that was 1907 to 1914, something like that.
I don't think I gave a date, but it's much later than that.
Well, that's what I had on 1907, but it would seem to be contradicting Teddy Roosevelt's Japanese Monroe Doctrine for Asia, in which he basically gave the Japs
I understand what you're saying.
Korea and Manchuria.
Yes.
And, you know, this is a latest book by Bradley on an imperial cruise. And it talks about this early in the 19th century. And of course, Teddy was a very Navy man. But here, if you read that book, you see he was very, very favorable to Japan and whatever Japanese wanted to do in Asia.
Yes.
And so it seems a contradiction.
Well, there are a lot of contradictions in history, which is what makes it so fascinating. That's one of the reasons that we like what we do, because there's so many gray areas. But what in the greater scheme of things, for most of the world, Korea simply doesn't matter. Okay. What matters is the relationship with Japan. Yes, and in that period, it's much closer. And, things only start going downhill a little later. And then in the 20s and the 30s, the United States begins to restrict immigration from Japan. We interfere with them getting at their oil resources, and our relationship with them deteriorates over time. But if you think of, in the scheme of things, about how history moves and how quickly things changes, even in the United States, say from one election to the next, that it seems odd, but it's not unprecedented for that kind of shift to take place.
I think one of the problems at Tarawa was the Marines were let off the ships, and many of them drowned. They had not done a good reconnaissance of the actual landing area. Mm-hmm. That was one of the lessons they learned from that, right, was that you needed what we eventually came to be called force reconnaissance, mm-hmm. to go in and actually figure out where the places were to land and where the places were to avoid, because, isn't that correct? A lot of them drowned trying to.
There's an explanation for that. Yes, you're right. Yes.
Yes. Well, but that's, again, one of those things where you're testing your doctrine. They knew were not going to be the best beaches for landing, but what does that mean exactly? So this is an early test of a very complicated doctrine. And that's where many of those people, many of those casualties do occur. But again, it is that mixing bowl of theory and experience where you wind up with a doctrine that actually serves you well and accomplishes what it is you're trying to accomplish. And sometimes it's a very sad mix.
Three things to this gentleman's question here. Were we trying to get out around the world and learn from other people about that? The answer to that is yes. There were two officers in particular, both of whom become generals. One becomes a commandant. Victor at the Brute Krulak was one. He spent a lot of time with the Brits doing this in time out in the Pacific. Also Wallace Green, who becomes commandant of the Marine Corps in the early years of Vietnam. He spent a lot of time doing the same thing with the British, taking a look at how other people are doing amphibious operations and what kind of equipment they've got, particularly the Japanese with the equipment. The other issue about Plan Orange, you begin to see the early phases of Plan Orange in about 1903. It's interrupted by World War I, and then after World War I, we start, hanging meat on the skeleton, if you will, to develop what becomes a robust Plan Orange for the Second World War. On the Marines waiting ashore, the Gilberts are at it is unusual. latitude and longitude in which what is called the dodging tide is found. Unlike neap and spring, which are mathematically predictable, the dodging tide is not. And the amphibious tractors crawled over the coral, the flat-bottom landing craft got caught in the unpredictable low tide and got hung up. And so that's why the Marines had to march it, well, way to shore for all that distance.
From about 100 yards?
Oh, no, it was much further than that.
Okay.
Much further than that. But it was one of those unpredictable tide that we knew about it. We were hoping that we would get it at the right time and be able to sail over the reefs, and we couldn't. By the way, the actor Eddie Albert, whom I'm sure many of us remember, was a Navy landing craft commander, got inside the lagoon and picked up a lot of dead and dying Marines during that particular evolution there.
I think there's a question back here.
In the Pacific campaign, I assume that the Tarawa was the first experiment. I was wondering what was the second objective, the second island, so to speak, and what did we learn from the first one that we put into effect with the next landing?
Okay. Well, some of those lessons learned I talked about in terms of coordination. Who's going to be in charge of what? So there's improvements in combat loading. There's improvements in understanding what naval ships fire support would look like. Those kinds of things are improved. But in terms of the next landing, I'm uncertain of that, so I'm pretty sure one of my Marines here can tell you that. No? But not a Marine, but nevertheless has the answer.
He's been heavily influenced by the Marines.
That's true. That's true. My recollection is that it was Macon and Tarawa were first, and then Eniwatok and Kwajalein.
Okay. Eniwetok and Kwajalein.
One of the things you learn too, the Marines learn here, is the fact that it helps to have a radio that's waterproof.
You know, another thing too that we forget, no matter where we went in the Pacific, there are two really important things we're looking for. We're looking for places that have airfields or land that will support an airfield, and we're looking for anchorages for ship repair. And so the video that Janet showed you of Bayshore showed you that long airfield. But in the rest of the Gilberts, there are 5 other airfields that will handle anything in the U.S. inventory in 1943. It won't handle the B-29, but it will handle anything. So we get 6 airfields out of this. And that's sort of lost in the dustbins of history. But that's why we go to a lot of these places, because of the airfields and the anchorages.
And we don't always wind up needing them. There may be ways to jump from one island to the next without necessarily using all of the assets that are there. But early in the war, you're essentially taking anything that you think might be useful to you. Later on, as it becomes apparent that the Japanese are weakening, we can be a little more selective in what we will do and what we won't do. Yes, sir?
Oh, thank you. Professor, my name is Mark Johnson. I teach in the law school and the journalism school here. And this question isn't exactly on point, but I hope you can help me with something that I've been mystified by for a long time. You talked about Gallipoli. I wonder if, I've long wondered if there was a connection between the disaster at Gallipoli that cost, tens of thousands of Australian and New Zealand lives, and the Australian insistence on pulling out of Tobruk in World War II, where it presented a huge logistical and strategic problem for the British. Churchill spends quite a bit of time talking about this in his, I can't remember which volume of his history of the war, but in one of them, the Australians, at a time when it was of great disadvantage to the British, insisted on pulling all of their forces out of Tobruk. It was 42, 43, I can't remember exactly when it was. And do you have any idea if there was sort of lasting unhappiness with Churchill because Gallipoli was supposed to be his baby. And I just wonder if there was ever any connection drawn between those two events.
I don't know if they are directly related, but there's certainly lasting displeasure with Churchill, not just among the Australians and New Zealanders, but among the British. It's not everybody who loves him during World War II. He's taken on that star status really as a post-World War II kind of figure. But it may be that one of my colleagues has a response specifically to the Tobruk question. Yeah, and I don't know, do you have?
I don't think that Tobruk know I'm sorry. I don't know if there's a connection. As a historian, we can only go off the documented evidence or, first-person evidence. I don't know of any. If there is, sir, I'm not aware of it. I don't know if any of my colleagues are. But as Dr. Valentine articulated, Churchill's star falls appreciably with Gallipoli. He's fired as First Lord of the Admiralty and those kinds of things. And there is that lasting, bitterness that the Australians have. And as those of you who know Aussies, that is a defining moment in their history. It is their 4th of July and, Anzac Day. Yes, sir. It's a defining moment in their history. Whether or not that translated into the Pearl Letter to Tobruk, I don't know of that connection, unless there's some evidence out there that would articulate that support. I'm not aware of any.
And certainly, by the time World War II begins, the Australians have begun to understand that they really need to be looking to the United States for support and protection where they had traditionally looked to the British. Now, those nascent sort of understanding of the United States as the power they need to associate with is fully developed. That egg hatches after World War II, but the nuggets of that understanding are already present at the beginning of the war. Mr. Metter has a response.
The issue of bringing the regular Aussie army back home is really just a matter of manpower. By the time Tobruk falls, they're already starting to see some cracks in the German effort in North Africa having reached the end of its tether. It would only begin to collapse after that. But until we have success at Guadalcanal, which ends, January of 1943, there had been no stopping of the Japanese juggernaut in the Pacific, other than the naval success at Midway. Australia had by this time already planned to surrender the top 50% of the Australian landmass to the Japanese. That was already a plan they had in their kit bag in the event the Japanese were able to establish a foothold there. So bringing home the Australian regular army back to defend their homeland was really a manpower issue. And many of the videos, for example, that you see of Australian troops in New Guinea in those early days are Australian, what they call the Home Guard, what we would call our National Guard, not the regular Australian National Army. So, these guys are really reaching down for all they can get and having to pull forces back home to defend their hearth and home back in Australia.
No, ma'am, behind, I'm sorry. There's a lot of blue shirts.
When did the Marine Corps get its own air arm? And was the Corsair designed specifically for the Marine Corps?
I don't know the year, but no, the Corsair was not
The Corsair
designed.
was originally a naval fighter. The problem is its nose sat too high. It was considered unsafe for naval aviation because of the view from the pilot. Couldn't safely see the landing deck. That was later modified. The Navy did adopt it for aboard on carriers. Because the Navy didn't want it in usual suit, they gave it to the Marines.
If you'd like to know any other structural details about the Corsair, Dr. Curatola can help you with that. He can tell you how many rivets are there.
What would be the scenarios today where we would use an amphibious assault? And wouldn't it take just unbelievable air superiority and sea superiority to even attempt something like that?
So you asked a question. As as a retired Marine officer, it's been 10 years, so I'm a little older and whiter than I was 10 years ago. But you're asking a very relevant question. And this is something the Marine Corps, and Bud, jump in here, something the Marine Corps deals with regularly. Are we ever going to do this again? Is the cost worth it? Are you willing to send your sons and daughters and treasure for something that is as difficult as amphibious assault? The answer is a lot more complicated than yes or no. One of the things that the Marine Corps would tell you is that the fact that you have that capability, that it's in your back pocket, is a weapon in and of itself. If I may go back just relative quick history, Desert Shield, Desert Storm. 5th MEB is sitting out in the Persian Gulf. 5th MEB is never going to assault the beaches of Kuwait. But Saddam Hussein doesn't know that. That allows the U.S. Army to do the big left hook because much of the Iraqi army is sitting in Kuwait waiting for the Marines to go ashore. And we're not going to pay the price as you just articulated. So again, an example of a feint, a capability that in and itself is a weapon. Now, will the Marine Corps do these kinds of things again? What does the future of warfare look like? And that's the million-dollar question. If I knew that answer, I wouldn't be working at CGSC. I'd be in the White House, I guess. But anyway.
He would be working at CGSC because he loves
The
it.
next question is then, I mean, they have much more, I don't want to use the word air academy because that might be offensive to a Marine, but I mean, they would ferry a lot more Marines by helicopter now, wouldn't they?
We do what you call vertical emplacement. We do both now, because obviously this time you didn't have helicopters. And so you do have the ship-to-shore movement piece, and you have the vertical envelopment piece as well. So it's a two-pronged approach now in terms of amphibious assault. And the question that you bring up is a good one, too, because do you have, and as Dr. Valentine pointed out, the amphibious assault platforms, the large ships, to move a Marine force like a division to a given location to conduct an amphibious assault? There is a shortage of amphibious ships within the United States Navy today. For us to do an amphibious assault of the scale that you see in the Pacific, you would have to sortie basically every amphibious ship the U.S. Navy has. And remember, we have East Coast, West Coast, and the Far East. You'd have to sortie basically all of those ships in one location, which is not going to happen, obviously. And so there is a dearth of amphibious shipping today to conduct the kind of operation that we would have done in World War II.
But those limitations are, again, not new to this period. In World War II, one of the arguments that the commanders of the different theaters had was who really should get that amphibious shipping and who really ought to have the most amphibious capability. And one of the reasons, of course, that D-Day is delayed, the assault at Normandy is delayed, is simply because we don't have enough ship-to-shore craft to make that possible. When we discuss your basic question in class, one of those conundrums that comes up is how many times can you feint before your enemy knows you're bluffing? Is one enough, or can we do this again? The other thing that is much on the mind of students right now is the role of drone aircraft, of UAVs, of cyber, and how much of that sort of traditional capability, of which, for which we have great affection, how much of that traditional capability is going to be overcome by those technological developments. Not just, of course, the technology itself, but the ideas, the theories that people come up with for applying those technologies. And, this is another good use of this lesson, is that, okay, you have the theory, or you have the technology. How do you apply the theory, or how do you apply the technology? And so those questions come up regularly, but they have as wishful or tentative as answers as we have offered you here.
If I may, to further your question, please don't confuse amphibious assault with amphibious movement. Those are two separate operations. Amphibious assault is what Dr. Valentine talked about with Tarawa. amphibious movement is just getting me from ship to shore in a relatively benign environment. That's something that we can do today. We do it very well. Amphibious assault, that's an animal of another shape. And so when we look at capability sets, can the Marine Corps do amphibious assault today? Yes, it's very difficult. Can we do amphibious movement? Do it every day. And we do it very, very well. Thank you very much. One thing about the Marine Corps, too, and I'll thump my chest here, is that the Marine Corps during this time and pretty much subsequent to it is the only service in the world that is looking at amphibious assault. The Japanese have amphibious movement capability in the 30s, but it's ship-to-shore movement, find out where the enemy is and go somewhere else, okay? The Marine Corps is doing the amphibious assault piece, going into the teeth of enemy defenses. That's an important distinction between the two movements. Does that answer your question, sir? Thank you.
This question is a little bit off topic. However, when I was at Marine Basic School in the early 60s, the emphasis was the emphasis was on Russian tactics, as I recall. And now I'm wondering, now it used to be 8 months, now it's down to 6 months. I was wondering, what is the course of study now at the basic school? It seems so complicated with so many activities and terrorist things going on and everything else.
Thanks for dating me. It's been 30 years myself since I've been to the basic school. I know it's been longer than that for Mr. Metter over there. Haven't not gone to the basic school in that long, but I will echo the issue that Dr. Valentine brought up is, what does the future of warfare look like? And that's a damn tough question. Is it state-on-state warfare, or is it something less, like you saw in Iraq, where you're fighting, you know, an insurgent warfare? These are very difficult questions that, quite frankly, we don't have answers for.
I think it's fair to say that for the last 15 years, that all services have focused largely on how to counter an insurgency. So coin doctrine of one form or another has dominated the training and the application of each service.
Basic School, 1955. Warfare in the future, is it going to be anywhere near what it was in the past, where we controlled territory, as opposed to small individual skirmishes?
I don't think we can fairly answer that. Those are the questions that the big brains are looking at. For instance, the military has been for some years and will continue to experiment with the idea of exoskeletons. For those of you who have seen Iron Man or used to read the Iron Man comic books, that idea is being fully and intentionally explored. The idea of robots is already in place, for instance, with most obviously with things like explosive neutralization. We send robots, and their police do it as well, but why send a man in if you can send a robot and have someone control that from a distance? So we don't even know what a fighter will look like in the distant or not so distant future. We can't be sure of that. And don't forget that we now have women in combat arms. So the face of war is changing all the time. I'm probably limited in my thinking because I think like a historian as opposed to a futurist, but that is an entire field of study in its own, and the military employs or contracts a variety of futurists to consider what might be most useful to it in the future, and a lot of that is rightly classified. We won't know until it's fielded.
You know, back to your very good question from the class of 55 at the basic school. The threads of continuity are the same today as they were in the time of Caesar and, you know, guys before. The issues of warfare, the violence, the fear, the need, obviously, for policy that makes sense. So I think what I would tell you is that it's all situationally dependent. Everything Dr. Valentine just mentioned is the gospel truth, all the high-tech stuff that we've got today. I mean, it really is gee whiz Star Wars stuff. But in some cases, depending upon the situation and the enemy that you wind up fighting, may be very primitive, in which high-tech solutions don't necessarily work. We certainly saw that in Vietnam a lot. So, you know, I think the educated military leader is going to take those things into account. What's the nature of the threat? And then we as an institution and as a people have to be smart enough to figure it out. And after that, I'll shut my yap and just ask Dr. Janet. She's going to tell anybody how the Marines usually walk up on the water. Or part the waters. Did you guys do that in 55?
Haven't Marines always walked on the water?
He did. He was recon.
Ah.
To make us to check civil, we sent him to land. Mr. Lieutenant.
Well, I've always had a soft spot for Marines. My parents were both Marines in World War II, and it just turns out that I happen to marry a retired Marine.
I have a comment rather than a question, and this has to do with whether this elaborate amphibious assault doctrine would ever be used again. And that is that strategic tensions are ramping up between the U.S. and the Chinese in the Western Pacific. And if you look at these artificial islands that the Chinese are creating, they always have they're archipelagos that are just a few feet below the water, and they're dredging them up so that they're a few feet above the water instead. But they have maybe a dozen of these, but they all have several things in common. One being they always create an anchorage. One being that they immediately create an airstrip. One being that they have enough room for troops and material, in other words, facilities. Which means that they basically are identical to Tarawa, that they're basically mass-producing artificial Tarawas in the South Pacific. They're intruding into the territories of other powers, that is clearly within their within the part of the sea that they own. So that it may be just a matter of time until we have to make it clear to the Chinese that we can capture these archipelagos. Or make them believe that we can capture one, or vice versa, that the Chinese will grab some island where we have to retake it or leave the Western Pacific. That might be the Senkakus, that might be some outlying island of the Philippines, it might be something in the Marshalls. Anything that the Chinese would take, we would then be obliged to retake, and we'd be using doctrine pretty much like this.
Mm-hmm. And you know, all of those are potentialities. As I mentioned, you know, there are a lot of people who are looking into the future. Some of them practitioners, and some of them, you know, sort of pure theorists. One of the things we also have to consider, though, is we have many more standoff weapons than we had during the interwar years of World War II. And so that makes that question about whether or not we'll ever need this particular assault doctrine or something that looks like it is just, it's really hard to answer. And we might not know until there is a different enemy than we currently have.
Are you talking about then, like, going to war without declaring war on those islands? In the China, yeah, I'm talking, yes, you. And,
It's his fault, yeah.
And also, did they use any of this information in the beaches, on the beaches of Normandy?
What information? I'm sorry,
I
this
mean,
doctrine?
like landing.
Oh, of
and
course,
all like
yes.
that.
You know,
Okay.
study, yeah, all of the, you know, the need, what are you going to need to land? How much are you going to need to land? What do you need to know in order to land? What the tides look like? All of that transfers to the Atlantic theater, to the European theater as well. It's just not, mostly it is not used in the same way. There are places where you see opposed landings, for instance, in Anzio. And Normandy, of course, is opposed. It doesn't look anything, it doesn't really look like what you see in the Pacific, but it is also opposed. So you still have to bring that forward. It's just going to look a little different from theater to theater.
May I comment or reply?
If we have time.
All right. All right. I have no idea how things will evolve in the Pacific, what the accompanying military policy would be on both sides, or what the accompanying diplomatic policy would be on both sides. But it's apparent that military tension is growing, and that it will continue to grow, and that there will be some kind of strategic rivalry between the U.S. and China in the Western Pacific. You have ships and planes interacting all the time. It's occasionally, a plane is shot down or captured, or a small ship is sunk. That's already happening. And it seems to me that either there will be a Cold War with China, similar to the Cold War we had with Russia, in which case every military encounter would be carefully measured and carefully restrained, but still occasionally have one. That's possible. Or it could somehow get out of control and you could have something larger. That's also possible. I suspect the former is more likely, something like a new Cold War with China.
We have time for one more short question.
Could I respond just one
Okay,
thing?
we don't have time for a question.
And it ties back into your original theme of doctrine. Is there a doctrinal apparatus in place that will deal with the kind of situation that Dr. Huber just talked about? And the answer is yes, and we had it during World War II, and as a matter of fact, you see the early seeds of it in Lieutenant Colonel Pete Ellis, the sort of the renegade that General Lejeune sent out there in the 1920s. And it's called Advanced Force Operations. And what that is, it's a planning process, it's a thinking process, literally, of just how you peel the onion back. What steps are necessary in certain areas to do certain things to eliminate the threats that a force, if they had to move there, would be facing. So trying to tie back into the whole doctrinal issue, that has been thought through in terms of a process to deal with that relative to, how are we doing it right now? I don't know that.
Thank you so much for coming today. I've enjoyed the opportunity to talk to you. I hope you have had your questions answered, but if you haven't, please feel free to ask any of the many historians who are in the room. We are historians. We love to share those things with you. Thank you.
One question.